Oh, hey, I didn't see you there. My name's Morgan Schitter, and I'm the Natural Resource Specialist at the Warrick County Soil and Water Conservation District. Oh, and what am I doing out in this field? Well, I'm actually doing CRP checks today. No, not CPR checks, CRP checks. That is the Conservation Reserve Program. That's one of the many federal programs that is offered through the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS, that we work with very closely at SWCD. Right, I'm not just out here enjoying the beautiful day. I'm actually out here to look at what I'm standing in right now, which might look like just some grass on the side of the road, or maybe just an overgrown patch next to a cornfield. But really, this is an important piece of land that really helps our local ecosystem, and it's something that this farmer has volunteered to put in on their field through that program. So come along with me, and I'll tell you a little bit more about CRP.
So CRP is a program through the Natural Resource Conservation Service, but frequently the soil and waters of a county take over doing the checks. So this time of year is when myself and other employees of the Soil and Water Agency are walking out in the fields and looking at these practices. Some of the things that we look for are the size of the practice. So is it the correct width? Is it the correct length? We also look at the species that are in it, and we're going to be talking about what species are good and bad later in this video. We also look for erosion that might be happening or forming in any of these practices, or if there is any areas where water is ponding or pooling, or where sediment has laid down any of the vegetation, kind of covered it up and made a bare spot. So really, as the natural resource specialist for Warrick County, it is my job to drive out to these fields and take a look at them to see how they're doing.
All right, so let's talk about what CRP really is and why it is so important to not only my office and to farmers, but to all of our local environment. So I said a conservation reserve program, and you can break that down into mainly conserving and reserving parts of a field. So my backdrop here is actually a filter strip here in Warrick County, and it is a very nice looking filter strip, I must say. But this would most likely be planted in corn right now if it wasn't enrolled in this program. I say that because it is bordering a cornfield right now, but there's a good 120 feet between the corn and where this ditch starts behind me. So the trees that you can see behind me are coming out of the ditch that's nearby. That's not part of the filter strip. The filter strip is all of this lower vegetation, although it's not too low right now. I think all that rain gave our grass a growth spurt. But it's all the grass and lower vegetation that you can see around me. It's not all that tall, woody vegetation in the background. But this might have been cropped if not for this program. So we are conserving this portion of land by not having it go into a cropping system. And it is getting reserved out of the yield for this field. So that's kind of where those two words come from, the CR and CRP. The reason that we do that is there is a lot of benefits to having little strips like this along your field or along roads or even within the field. So I said filter strip earlier. That is a kind of practice. A filter strip is a CRP practice that borders an already existing ditch or waterway. And so that ditch behind me is why this particular patch is considered a filter strip. So it is the mediator between the crop field and the ditch that's behind me. Having this little portion of land between those two helps cut down on erosion. So if this had been cropped, even if there had been no-till or cover crops on this field, you would still lose a little bit of erosion just to the ditch embankment edge as the water runs through that ditch or runs over the field and into that ditch. But by having this patch of grass here, which has roots all year long, it is keeping this sediment on the property. So this field isn't getting any smaller. Another great thing that these filter strips can do is right in the name. They filter, so any water that goes across this that might be carrying pollutants like soil or sediment, that will get filtered out before it reaches the ditch. So that helps us keep our smaller waterways and then ultimately our larger waterways clear of debris like trash or litter or sediment or even fertilizer that might be on the field. This grass also helps the water that goes over it infiltrate into the ground, so that can reduce ponding in this area and again helps guard against erosion from the cropping field. So filter strips are normally in the shape of a long strip of vegetation, and they are always going to be adjacent to an established ditch. So the one here is in between a ditch and a cropping field, and it actually goes quite a long distance back into this field. In an earlier shot, you might have been able to see where it curved around a tree line, and it continues bordering this entire field all the way down to where this field ends, actually. So these are large portions of field that are taken out of production, but they are put into ecosystem. Not only do these strips help with cutting down on erosion and infiltrating water, but they can be an important resource for our native species. Things like native birds that need shelter and food, and insects like pollinators that need flowers growing, and even small mammals and reptiles and amphibians can use these strips as habitat and as a food source. So they help in a number of ways, which justifies taking some of your field out of production. And of course, these voluntary farmers that partake in our CRP program are compensated from the NRCS by federal funds to make up for their loss of yield on the particular portion of land that they are removing from their production. All right, so this is just to give you some scale, if it's hard to tell on the screen, how big this filter strip I'm in really is. It's about 120 feet from cornfield to ditch, and it goes back way, way further than that, over 1,000 feet back behind me where it curves around the trees, because it borders this entire field. All right, let's do a little bit of grass ID now. I've got 3 different kinds of grasses here in front of me. All 3 of these grasses are very common species to be found in all the CRP practices here in Warrick County that I commonly check. First up, right here on the right, we have tall fescue. So that is the seed head for tall fescue. You can see some of it's already come off just from me pulling this stem from the grass patch. And you might be able to see up close a little bit what that seed head looks like. In the middle here, I have orchard grass. This is another common species of grass, and it's got a much shorter, fatter, branching seed head that stays close. And then on the left, I have the seed head for Timothy grass, and this one is almost like a cattail. So it is completely solid with just small bristles coming out off of it, but it doesn't have any major branches along the seed head. Now, all 3 of these are examples of grass seed heads. So this is the part of the grass that grows up, forms the seeds, and then those seeds are commonly brushed off by wind or by animals going through the grass. So I'm not showing you any blades of grass because grass is really difficult to ID just from the blade. So most of the time when we're out doing CRP checks, it's the perfect time of year to see the larger, more identifiable seed heads on these grasses. So the seed heads are the major way that I can identify the grasses out in these CRP practices. So filter strips are only one kind of practice that we have in Warrick County. The other two common practices that I see are introduced grass fields and waterways. So earlier I said waterway interchangeably with ditch, which was probably not a great idea for this video, because when I say waterway, I am not talking about a ditch that carries water, or a creek, or a river, or anything like that. A waterway is actually very similar to a filter strip in that it is a strip of grassed land, but rather than bordering a ditch, it goes straight through the field. So it doesn't border anything. They go right through the middle of a field, and they're bordered by a crop field on either side. Normally they have an outlet at a road or at the end of the field, but otherwise they're just out in the middle of the field with no real structures around it to determine how far it goes or where it's at. Waterways are useful for natural low areas of a field. So they are just strips of grass. They have a bowl shape. So you might think of the waterway cross section being U-shaped or bowl-shaped. It's not this intense, but this is the shape that it has as it goes along the entire length of the field. And that is so that when water from the field gets to that waterway, it will naturally move down into that low area in the middle, and then it will follow that waterway down all the way out to its outlet. And they do pretty much the exact same thing as filter strips. They cut down on erosion. They can also help water infiltrate into the ground. But on top of that, they also help to slow down water. So water can get really concentrated in low areas, and it can start rushing really fast. And at that point, it can start destroying crops, it can destroy the field, and it's going to take all of that sediment with it wherever it's going. So having all of this grass and other kinds of vegetation in the middle of the field can help slow down that water before it gets wherever it's going. So that way it's not going as fast, and you're cutting down on erosion or any damages at the outlet of the waterway.
All right, so the next thing that we are going to be discussing is the CRP practice called introduced grasses. Unfortunately, I have had to move indoors for the remaining portion of the video because my camera overheated and it refused to cooperate until I brought it inside where it's cooler. You know, you can quote me on that the next time somebody says technology is going to replace us, it couldn't even stand out in a field for 30 minutes before it had to go inside. But the next practice that I look at frequently is introduced grasses. So there is a native grasses CRP practice that's separate. But introduced grasses are grasses that are not native to our area, but they are not harmful. They're things like tall fescue, orchard grass, timothy grass, a lot of the same kinds of grasses that are in filter strips and in waterways. But rather than being in a strip, like filter strips that are adjacent to a ditch, or rather than being a strip that's in the middle of the field, like a waterway, introduced grass practices are usually just a rectangular or square portion of a field, and they don't have to border anything. They don't have to have a particular shape. They can be any shape they want to be, triangles, squares, rectangles. Most of the time, they are just a portion of field that's taken out and kept in introduced grasses. Now, I've been saying a lot about how they all kind of share the same kinds of vegetation, and that's true. So a lot of times when NRCS is planning these CRP practices, they use a lot of the same seed mixes for them because they are all grasses that grow really well and can support these kinds of ecosystems and the kinds of sediment and water loads that they are expecting. So fescue, orchard grass, Timothy grass, Kentucky bluegrass are all options of grasses, but also something else that all these practices share, that is introduced grasses, filter strips, and waterways. They all have to have some kind of legume. So legumes are the nitrogen fixers of vegetation. So most of the time I see ladino clover, which is also known as white clover. It's the kind of stuff that you probably have in your yard or that you could see on the sides of the road. That is a good nitrogen fixing plant that is common in a lot of these practices. Another common one is red clover, which if you don't know or haven't seen it, red clover is actually more of a pink color. And there is a red colored clover, but it is called crimson clover. So ladino or white clover, red clover, and then sometimes crimson clover are all legumes that are picked for filter strips, waterways, and introduced grasses. And that is one, in part, to have something that actually flowers. So grasses, they seed out, but they don't really have flowers like a lot of actual flowering plants have. They kind of just have that seed head, or the flowers are really small on grasses. So those flowers help provide a food source to pollinators and a food source to animals in that area, as well as just diversifying what we see out in those particular practices. Now, something else you might have noticed when I was out in the field or from some of the pictures on screen is that this filter strip, other practices in CRP, they are not all 100% grasses and legumes. So originally when they are planned, they are set, a seed mixture is set for these practices that includes those kinds of grass species and legume species. But of course, when you are out in nature, that isn't always going to be the case forever. Even if you do all the maintenance in the world on these practices, you will never keep 100% of it in those grass species and those legume species that were originally planted. And that is okay. We are not asking for 100% coverage. The amount of grasses is important. You want to have mostly grasses in the field in that particular practice. And you also do want to have a healthy stand of legumes present. But if there is milkweed growing out in them, that is perfectly fine. In fact, I love seeing milkweed when I'm out doing my CRP checks. It's fine to have things like goldenrod or other native flowering plants or native grasses that are growing out there. Now, something that is important is that we don't see any invasives. So, of course, invasives will make their way into any established vegetation in our area. But we have a 10% rule, which is that if we see cumulative invasive species occupying over 10% of the filter strip, then that is when it becomes a problem. So you have to keep invasives down to under 10%, and we do the same thing with woody vegetation, which is just any trees or things like blackberry bushes, maple saplings, oak saplings, anything like that. We want to keep all that stuff down to under 10% because that means that 90% of that particular practice is working as intended with nice natives and grasses, and it makes great habitat. So I do a really important job, which is just getting eyes out on these fields and just taking a look, making sure that they are working as intended, that they're providing habitat for animals, that they are helping with cutting down on erosion in the field and water in the field. Because at the end of the day, I want all of these practices to be working as intended. I want them to be doing all of the great things that they can do, helping the ecosystem, helping the farmer, helping everybody involved. and just to make sure that things are running smoothly.